All right, ladies and gentlemen, we are here to rock and roll. My guest, one and only Phillip Fracassi. Phil, how you doing today?
I'm good, thank you, Joshua. Thanks for
Did you
having
hear
me.
me?
Yeah,
Yeah.
can
Oh,
you hear me now?
I hear you just fine. I just hear you just fine. Just for a minute there, it looked like you were frozen. It's just like, oh, this is just
Oh,
wonderful. No, it's like it's not meant to be. Right. So I want to thank Phil for his gracious. So, dude, just to get started here, um, tell the audience what you do.
yeah. I mean, I'm a horror writer. I write screenplays, but I primarily write horror fiction. I've published a couple of short story collections and a few novellas, and uh, I have a couple novels coming out in the next few months, and another novel coming out next summer that'll be worldwide. So, yeah, just I'm a writer, and I kind of focus on horror, but I also write science fiction and other stuff as well.
All right, but horror love, but horror is your true love.
Yeah, horror is the focus for sure. Yeah, horror fiction is primarily where I spend my days, um, and occasionally I get sucked into a film project. And lately I've been focusing more on the novels and the short stories. So I have a lot of novels coming out.
Cool. So, what got you into horror? Like, what was the magic thing that said I'm in?
Well, I think with a lot of writers, my generation, we were influenced by the 80s and 90s, trifecta of Stephen King and Clive Barker and Dean Koontz. And, those guys were a big deal when I was a teenager and kind of got me into that genre. I think a lot of people get into the genre through film, horror movies and stuff like that. I definitely got into it through fiction. Um, and yeah, I actually spent most of my life writing not genre, not horror. I wrote a lot of what would be called literary fiction, and but I was writing horror screenplays and having some success with that. I had a movie on Lifetime television, and and then I just kind of made the decision about 7 years ago, I guess now, to start writing horror fiction, and things have really taken off for me since then. So it's been a lot of fun.
Okay, so there's a couple of angles we can go with here. So I'm gonna start the first one. You said you loved horror in the beginning. So why'd you end up in literary first?
That's a good question. I don't really know, and I'm not really sure why it took me so long to make that decision. I think it was just, I did write a lot of like when I was a kid, I wrote a lot of genre stuff for fun. But I guess when I got older, and I don't know, I think there's a part of my brain that was sort of thinking that, well, when you're writing, it's got to be more serious, and it can't just be like fun and games. But screenplays, you can have, you can kind of do whatever you want because it's just a movie or whatever. So I think I kind of had to make that leap, you know to go, well, wait a minute, the fiction writing can be fun too, and I can do what I want to do, and I don't have to do necessarily what I feel I should be doing and writing kind of more serious literary fiction. So I just, yeah, one day I just made that kind of connection, and literally it's been just kind of nonstop ever since then. That was I've been kind of racing to keep up with that the genre stuff. So I've been really fortunate to have some success there.
So I think me and you, in one sense, so I realized this at a very young age. When in doubt, screw up. You can have fun, right? So I used to when before the pandemic, I would do a show where I get grown up authors, Dr. Seuss, in like different voices. If you have not lived until you've heard Fox and Socks in a Valley Girl voice. I'm just saying,
Hmm.
it's one of those things you have to listen to it live to believe. It's hilarious, but it's fun. I think when all of which to say at the point I'm getting to is, I think as an author we have the natural. I think some of the best fiction is comedic by nature. Like I look at Kurt Vonnegut, I look at Terry Pratchett, I look at people like that. they come up with some insightful truths in comedy, but they don't take themselves seriously, but they put serious things in their story. I think that's more, unfortunately, I think that's more of the abnormal, right?
Yeah.
I think we have this ability. I think we have this ability to. We have this thing. I think when we start that, this has to be serious. And in learning your craft, you should be serious, mostly, mostly, right?
Yeah.
Right. But yeah, it's supposed to be fun though, right? I mean, it's supposed to be absolutely a blast, and it's so much better when it is.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a definition, gap between serious and professional. I think you'd always want to be a professional when
Mhm.
when you're writing for something for publication, and um, I think, but you can also have fun with it, and I've learned, it's a lesson I've learned for sure, and it's also, one other thing I've learned over the last 5 or 6 years in writing in this field is that horror as a definition or as a category has become pretty pretty broad, and I think a lot of people who aren't familiar with a lot of genre fiction think, when they think of horror, they think of zombies, they think of ghost stories, they think of serial killers and monsters, and the reality is, horror has kind of become a really kind of almost like a slipstream catch-all for anything supernatural or preternatural thrillers. There's a lot of, I mean, yes, there's extreme body horror stuff, but there's also really thoughtful, beautiful stories. Everyone, and it's been going on. It's not new. Like, you can, Robert. Some people differentiate weird fiction and horror, and weird fiction is more like Robert Aikman, or it's more like serious, and it's a little less like Ghost in the Closet kind of thing, or the hand coming out from under the bed and grabbing your ankle sort of deal. And horror is more like, fun and games, like I said. But I think there's a lot of blur there. To your point, I've written novels that are very character oriented. They do have very strong thematic elements. But yeah, ultimately they're horror novels. But then I've written novels. So like my novel coming out next month, A Child Alone with Strangers, is sort of like a crime horror hybrid, but it's a very serious novel in a way. I mean,
Sure.
it's meant to be taken seriously in the sense that they're real. I want you to feel for the characters. I want you to be emotionally involved. And then there's a novel coming out in February called Gothic, which is really just supposed to be fun. It's supposed to be like a Sam Raimi movie, um, on paper. And then the novel coming out next summer, Boys in the Valley, is again kind of back to that. Like, it's actually more of a drama. Um, than anything, and but it's definitely considered horror because horrible things happen and there's some supernatural elements. So, but I like the sandbox that horror offers me as a writer. I like being able to go, one way or another, kind of depending on what kind of story I want to tell. So it's a fun genre to write in for sure.
Oh, absolutely. For me, I mean, if you want to look at an extreme in a franchise, Nightmare on Elm Street. Freddy Krueger for like the first three films was a terrifying monster, and
Right.
as you got later and later into the sequels, he became less serious. He actually became kind of fun, right? Which is just like, and you have that ability to do it. I kind of attribute good horror to at its best and most serious. It gives you a glimmer of possibility. Like, hey, you could see this in a moment happen, right?
Yeah.
Right, you can see that's when horror is at its absolutely at its best serious. But also, I mean, for that, there's also a zombie land where you can have a fun little post-apocalyptic story about a guy looking for a Twinkie in the apocalypse, if that's what you want to do, and it can still be fun. It still has horror in it, but it's like we're just here to have a good time, and there's nothing
Yeah.
wrong with either. There's nothing wrong with either way you choose to go.
Yeah. And I'm not, personally, you know, I don't write a lot of like
Yeah.
serial killer fiction or whatever. I do like the supernatural elements, and I like the supernatural elements because I like that it allows, to your point, endless possibilities. I just wrote an essay about this for American Library Association. I was talking about how horror just, it allows you to kind of do anything you want. You're not restricted by anything. In science fiction, you're sort of restricted a little bit by, like, well, it's got to actually be rooted in some sort of core, even if it's theoretical science, science to be science fiction. And fantasy, even fantasy has like its rules, its borders. It's all kind of that King Arthurian, you know, cloak, kind of thing, and sword and sorcery or whatever. And I feel like there's certain boundaries with fantasy. But I think with horror, you can it's batshit. You can do anything you want, and I think that's what makes it really it's really engaging for me as a writer. And I think it's why people will continue to come to it as readers. I wish it didn't have so much of a I wish people didn't have so much of a preconceived notion to horror, but I think that's changing slowly. I think people are really understanding that horror can be beautifully written. The prose can be just as strong and effective, and as a quote unquote literary novel. And there's a lot of writers today doing some interesting stuff with the genre. So I think it has a bright future, and I think it's going to continue to push push things different directions, and I think it's going to continue to expand.
So, lot to unpack there. I think so. Here's what I think. I think it's not just horror. I think it's fantasy. I think science fiction has a unique problem in publishing today, but we're not like in the sense that I feel like, ironically, of all the genres, science fiction is the most caught up in the past, which I think is a very ironic position for science fiction to be in, actually. Um, Considering it's the fiction that's supposed to go into the future, or one of the things it does very supposed to do very well. I have seen incredible evolutions in fantasy and in horror both. Um, Actually, I was going to ask you because some of what you're describing, the supernatural stuff, ties into urban fantasy, right? Like, there's definitely a line where you put urban fan. Like, I look at someone like Kim Harrison, who dabbles in both fantasy and horror and does it very, very well.
Mhm.
Um, like, she's found that urban fantasy seems to be that sweet spot to merge horror and fantasy together. So I was kind of curious, like, do you see it the same way, or is it like, do you feel urban's different somehow, some way?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty I think that's a pretty safe bet. I mean, there's guys like Alan Baxter who write you know urban fantasy or dark urban fantasy or dark, whatever you want to call it, and yeah, urban fantasy and horror. Uh, uh, there's a few writers I'm blanking on off the top of my head, but that who do that very well. Tim Wagner would be another one I think who does that very well. Yeah, definitely. I mean, urban fantasy. I mean, it's the it's one of those things where it's like it's unfortunately you need the categories because booksellers and libraries demand them, and it helps readers decide what they're gonna read. And I there's an element to that I wish there were more specific categories within horror so that people would have a better idea of what it could offer. But like I said, I think that like weird fiction and I think is at the end of the day, it's just such a broad genre. Um, but I think it's the preconceived notions that people have about it. And I think even to your point, like I think a lot of it stems from film and TV with like um, you know, uh, Freddy Krueger or whatever. And I think it's just like that's when they think horror, they think Nightmare on Elm Street, they think Friday the 13th, they think Halloween, and they don't really think about some of the more subtle or broad, ways that horror can be presented. And I think with streaming now, and there's so much more variety and there's so many more films being made independently and stuff like that. When like there's a lot of and also a lot of international films that are doing interesting things in the horror genre. I think that perception will slowly change, but yeah, I think it's just one of those things where you want to, I try and explain, probably over explain to people what my stories are like, which are kind of more like they tend to be more like supernatural thrillers versus like horror, straight up horror, but they have such strong horror elements that I also have to say I'm horror because otherwise you get people saying, what the hell did I just read? This was, I'm scarred for life and you didn't warn me. So I try and warn people by saying, and you still get that even with people who read horror, you still get those reviews where it was like, oh, why didn't you tell me somebody was going to die? That's awful. I'm triggered. And it's like, it's horror. You should probably know that's going to happen. But
Y-
go ahead.
what I was going to say as far as that goes. I mean, look, you take a risk whenever you read a book. Like, I'm not. I get why certain things have trigger warnings to them. There are certain scenes, and depending on how graphic you get, I can see it, especially with the way the kind of the world's working today. But at the same time, listen, if I'm going to read a western, I'm expecting two cowboys or a cowboy and an alien or something like that to fight. I think two guys to fight. That's what I'm expecting.
Right.
Someone isn't going to walk away from that, right?
There's going to be
If I'm
gun. There's going to be
reading,
bloodshed.
yeah, it's going to be. If I'm reading horror, I mean, horror does have a certain degree of broadness, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But what I was going to say was, I'm expecting something bad to happen to somebody along the way,
Sure.
right? That's right. Just somewhere, I feel it's gonna happen. I feel it's just gonna, you know, and how it happens. I mean, there's a degree of, there's a certain even degree of expectation. It's probably not going to be pretty, right? And not get
Yeah.
right. But that's horror. I mean, that's been horror for a very very long time. But going now deeper into what you're saying about films and stuff like that, I've worked in film. Horror's cheap to make, and that actually works in its advantage for a lot of indie filmmakers because you can do an awful lot with a
Right.
little with the language of cinema. And what I'm finding now is it's almost in one sense it's going back to like the Hitchcock language of cinema era of films, in that they're trying to create horror moments with how they tell the story, not so much what's in it. And I find that that's a much more fascinating thing, and that's the direction horror is going to, especially in film, like independent film. Um, Television is a there's always been horror elements in some of very popular shows. Usually in terms of it's fun. I'm thinking of like something like Tales of the Crypt, for example,
Right.
right? There's always like horror tends to go down the fun rock and roll kind of vein in television, which is fine. I think there's a place for that for sure. Um, and sometimes but that's just it. Like it's almost like the decentralization of how publishing in general has allowed people to kind of redefine what all these things actually are, right? So I didn't ask this, are you traditionally published or are you indie published?
I'm traditionally published. I'm my two collections are
Okay.
were released by Lethe Press, which is an independent press. They've been around for about 20 years. I've published a couple things with Earthling, which is a deluxe edition press, who's been around for about 20 years. Um, my October novel is coming out from Talos Press, which is
Okay,
part of
that's
Skyhorse. Yeah.
yeah.
Uh,
You've done like traditional, but you've
yeah.
done traditional for your whole life, which is cool. I'm not. There's no knock to that at all. It's just more like you've done one specific way. If you decided, we're just gonna say like something you wanted to try, experiment with stuff, you have the ability now to do it on your own. I'm not saying you would, but you could, right? In
Yeah.
terms of how you release it and stuff like that. And what I think what's happened is one of the benefits to that is it opens up all these different kinds of stories you can write, right?
Yeah.
All these different kinds of stories. Like you can have that spot for urban fantasy romance stuff. You have that spot for horror. You can have like a certain kind of monster horrors. You can have certain specific niche kind of horrors now that you maybe a publisher wouldn't touch, but you might be like, you know what? There's a fan base for it. Let's try it, right? There's more freedom to experiment now. Do you kind of feel that way?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I think it's, someone asked, the deal, I just did a two-book deal with Macmillan and Orbit for the next two summers, and they're obviously a big five press. But but at the same time, to your point, like
Yeah.
I published this I just self-published this little chapbook, so because it was just something I wanted to do, to your point, to experiment with, and it was kind of a crazy story, and I have like a online, fan group, and I wanted to do something special for them. And so yeah, I still like the idea.
Yeah,
I think I think you can still do, you know, just because you're published by
for
Big
sure.
Five doesn't mean you can't publish independently. I think and I think self-publishing is fine too. I just I think it's getting better. I think when about five, over the last few years it's gotten better. I think a lot of authors were putting out product, and they weren't, to my point at the head of this conversation, they weren't necessarily professional. They weren't getting they weren't having the stories, proofread. They weren't worried about the layout. They weren't getting like a good looking cover. They were just kind of like throwing stuff out into the ether. And I think self-publishing is amazing, and the margins are definitely better than working with a traditional publisher, but because you keep everything. But I think it's also important to create a professional product and to make sure that you still do all the things that you need to do to, if you're creating something for public consumption. um but yeah, no, if self I know a lot of self-published authors who do very, very well. I also know publishers who are authors who started their own publishing companies, like Adam Neville in the UK. He's a huge writer, and he publishes his own stuff now because it's just, if you have the time and the skill set to do that, it's a great it's a great way to keep a majority of the money that you bring in through your work. But it's a lot of extra work, obviously. So I
Oh,
would never be able to do what Tor Tor Nightfire is going to do for next summer on my own, so, and they're going to get the book out to a lot more readers than I would ever be able to. So there's pros and cons for sure.
well, I think this is just my. Hold on a second here. Looks like I had a moment there. Let's take a quick
You
second. Okay,
froze for
perfect.
just a second.
So anyway, with I know it just it did its thing. It did its thing. That's all. It just did its thing. So I would tell you is like what I'm seeing in publishing is you have a book. A legitimate question is what is the right way to publish it? And I say it like that, like take a romance novel for example. On your own, you can hit the market faster than any publisher can. And in that particular field, the demand for content is just incredible. So if you can get to a certain level of speed, you'd make more money on your own than you ever could with the publisher. On the flip side, right, there's still particular genres, like I'm going to say young adult, for example, where traditional publishing still is very much the place to be, right? And I think so. What I think is happened in publishing now specifically is this: it's no longer a sure thing what's the right way to go. There are factors like what do you want as a creative to accomplish with your book. You like again, no knock to anyone in the big five or smaller press or anyone going indie or Kickstarter or Soup. It's just for me, right? I see it more like now the variety of choices now created an option for an author to go, what is the best way for this particular project? And I think as time goes on, more and more that's going to become the case.
Yeah, I mean, it's really, success is really what you personally define it as, and it's really just ultimately what you want out of your creative endeavors, and if you what your goals are. And but yeah, if you it traditional publishing is absolutely glacial. I had a book, the book that's coming out next month, for example. I wrote that book uh 2018. So it took me about a year to sell it. Took about another year to get it set up. Um, Took about another year to get through all the proofing and editing and design stuff, and even after that, it got pushed. The publishing date got pushed a couple times. So that's a traditional process. Is you're going to be, from the day you submit that book to your agent, you're waiting. Even if it gets picked up within 3 months, which is implausible, but it happens. You're still looking at probably a solid year and a half to 3 years before it comes out, and that's very hard for a lot of people, a lot of writers to digest. To your point, they have the book done, they're excited about it, they just want to get it out there. And there's a lot of ways to do that. You could try and sell it to a very small indie press, which I've done a lot of. I have a children's book coming out from a small press. I did a book of poetry that's coming out from a small press, and but it's just because I didn't really, those weren't things I wanted to sit on for years and hope that they went to some bigger publisher. I didn't really care. I just wanted to get the books out, and
Yeah.
so yeah, you have those options now. And but I think with like these books that I have coming out now, you know, um, I'm I've made enough money selling those big five books where I can now write for the next year without having to worry about necessarily selling anything else right away. Whereas if I was traditionally, or if I was self-publishing, I wouldn't have that kind of luxury. So it's really a matter of, but like I said, to your point, it's really kind of project by project. I think um, there are books that you're like, I really think this belongs with a bigger publisher, and then there are projects where you're like, you know what, I'm just going to put this out, and I'm not as worried about it being, having all the marketing and stuff behind it, because I just want to get it out into the world. So yeah, like I said, it really depends on what you want out of that particular project, and what you expect to get back from it.
Well, it's also, I think, what's best for the project too. Like, I'll give you an
Yeah.
example. I do an Alice in Wonderland mythology mashup series where Alice is Pandora. I want to create a board game to go with it, right? Because it just feels like it's a cool way to keep telling that story, right? And then this is an advantage. Now, here's the thing: traditionally, as a general rule of thumb, won't do that because again, board games are a giant investment of time, effort, and money, and that's completely understandable, by the way, right? And I don't necessarily want to do this as an indie project because again, games are expensive, but maybe as a Kickstarter,
Mhm.
that would be an interesting project for that. And again, because Kickstarter fits certain criteria, right, for this particular project, right? Now I have a novel, a YA novel. I may decide to submit to a traditional publisher because, again, like I told you, YA still is very strong, has a very strong presence there, right? And so it's like maybe it makes sense for me to go there first, right? And it's just a simple, like, logical thing. And I think that's an amazing place to be an author. And I think as an author or a creative, it's incumbent on you at least to somewhat explore some of these things. Just say, okay, what is possible? I'm not saying we're going to do Brandon Sanderson's numbers, but we don't necessarily have to either, right?
Well,
But there's an audience for everybody.
he's a great example of somebody that started his own publishing company. He publishes now through his own brand, and he could be easily just dumping it to any of the, any of those big five prices that he's been publishing with over the years. But so he started his own thing. So but he also has a staff of 30 people, so he can do that. But and he's making millions and millions of dollars. So, but yeah, I think there's a million ways you can go. I think each project, like I said, this little chapbook I did, I wanted to do myself, and so I did it myself. But and there's some projects that I'm okay just saying, you know what, I'm just going to take this to a small press. And there's some projects where I'm like, no, I'm going to hold on to this and see if I can make a bigger splash with it.
Yeah.
So yeah, to your point, it really depends on what you're looking for. And I think a lot of anthologies, that I have stories in, or uh, or been invited to write for, they're a lot of those guys are doing the Kickstarter thing. Um, I think you see the Kickstarter thing a lot more with anthologies than you do necessarily with a one author deal, because they kind of rely on the fact that they'll have like a dozen names. They'll draw from all those
It,
authors' fan bases, but to fund the book. But yeah, but you can. Today is a totally different ball game. When I was publishing in the late '90s, I was I had 2,500 books in my garage, and I had to pay for everything up front, and I had to have a distributor in Pennsylvania who warehoused everything, and blah blah blah. And now all that stuff is gone. It's just you upload the file to Amazon, you hit click, and and you published a book. So it's a much different world.
yeah, technology made it publishing a much more easy thing. That's why more books are released now than ever. Some are great, some aren't so great, and that's part of the fun too. Like, that's just like every day it's an adventure if you want to look for new releases all the time. All right,
Yeah.
let's go back to your stuff for a little bit here. So you got 3 books coming out. You got different books coming out this year, and or next few months, I should say, and
In
over
the
the
next
next
year, yeah.
year or so. Yeah. So, like, because again, you're more traditionally published. Like, how long have these books been? Like, you mentioned in both one of them. Like, you wrote like years ago for one of them before it finally saw the light of day. Were the other ones a little luckier, or is it now just because the pandemic's over and things are starting to move again, like almost like they should?
Yeah. So I sold the yeah. So like I said, the one that's coming out in October, I wrote, like I said, about 3 or 4 years ago, and it took about 3 years to find to get from when we first started shopping it to publishing it. Book that's coming out in February, I sold it a year ago, so that's actually been a pretty quick turnaround. Um, and that's with Cemetery Dance, and and the book that's coming out this summer, that's with a traditional Big Five press. But that book I sold in February, so that again will probably be just over a year between selling it and having it come out. So those have actually moved a little bit faster, for different reasons. The one that's coming out this summer, um, Stephen King tweeted about it, and so there was sort of a crush to potential buyers. So we were able to sell it very quickly, and they're excited to get it out very quickly. So that's kind of an unusual turnaround. But I have a book, I have a two-book deal with those guys, Macmillan. So the second book's coming out July 2024, and that book I haven't even started writing yet. So that's a situation where I'm actually behind their schedule. I've got to catch up. So kind of it varies pretty widely, but I think the rule of thumb is it takes about 2 to 3 years from when you maybe start shopping a book to when you actually see it in publication, assuming it sells. You're talking between 2 and 3 years typically. Um, but yeah, so like right now everything I'm selling right now is for 2024 and 2025. So, but that's also a virtue of the fact that I have stuff coming out between now and then, so I can't really overcrowd the market, any more than I already have. If that
Oh,
answers your
no,
question.
I yeah, no, yeah, no. I'm kind of going in and out a little bit here, but we're still here. I promise. I promise. Um, no, it's like I said, it sounds to me like it's kind of gone kind of back on a right ship, and there's definitely faith in you. If they're going that quickly, they are going. They have big faith in who you are, which is kind of cool. Um, okay, so like I said, you've always had a love of horror. So the '80s were a big thing to you. So who did you read? Who did you read to really get into it? Because it sounds like it was more than just watching it; it was reading it that got you into horror.
Yeah, like I said, it was like I read a lot of King, I read a lot of Clive Barker, I read a lot of Dean Koontz when I was like a teenager. Um, I did read a lot of horror generally. I read a lot of science fiction. I was definitely a genre reader primarily. It wasn't until I was probably in my 30s, frankly, until I started reading uh, classics and more literary fiction. I'm not traditionally schooled or educated. I didn't go to college, so everything that I've read is sort of what I've wanted to read on my own. So I think a lot of people get that stuff forced down their throat when they're in their early 20s, and I think it's because it ends up being more of a chore. But in my 30s, I got really into reading a lot of like literary stuff. I read a lot of everyone from John Fonte to Paul Bowles to Hemingway to Flannery O'Connor. I could go on and on and on. I read about 100 books a year, so I was really getting into all that stuff, and I think what happened was, as I got to a certain age, um, I think those two kind of parts of my brain sort of came together, and the stuff I write now, I think a lot of people, I see a lot of comments from readers about how they're surprised in a way that it reads more literary, and there's a lot of time taken developing characters and stuff like that. I think a lot of horror is more just about, it's more like you said with the movies, they're more just like fast and scary and stuff like that. So I think I kind of combined all the stuff that I've read over the course of my life. But yeah, early days definitely was into those guys. I read a lot of when I was very young. I was reading a lot of like all the stuff that everybody else reads. I was reading a lot of C.S. Lewis and Tolkien and high fantasy kind of stuff. Um, so yeah, so I've kind of a pretty broad reading background. Nowadays, I read when I have time to read something for myself. I read. I read a lot of poetry. I read a lot of nonfiction. I like science stuff, but I also read a lot of the new horror stuff that's being written, which I enjoy a lot too. A lot of diverse writers, a lot of diverse voices um, coming out now. So it's a really interesting time to be a horror fan because there's a lot of cool stuff being written.
I think it's interesting too, but like from a timing standpoint, because I know like in the states at least, some of the bookstores have pulled the horror genre as a category in their bookstores. At least they did a
Yeah,
few years ago. I don't know if they've got reversed course or not on that, but
it
that
seems
that
to be
was the thing a few
reversing
years.
course. Seems to be
Yeah,
reversing course. I know what you're saying. They kind of everyone kind of lumped everything with like mysteries and thrillers or whatever, but I do know just because it's because I'm so tuned into distribution with because of what I do for a living that I do know that a lot of bookstores have been now building out their horror sections. What one thing that happened to that end, and I'm sorry to truncate your thought, but one thing that happened to that end was Barnes and Noble made it. Barnes and Noble made an announcement. I think it's about 2 years ago, where they were going to start letting all their bookstores operate independently as independent bookstores, meaning the buyers for those stores bought whatever they want, put whatever and shelved whatever they wanted. That just happened kind of recently, and that was a big deal for writers because all of a sudden you had all these brand new independent bookstores basically that popped up all over the country, and you could start hitting individual like Barnes and Noble retailers who were building out their horror sections. If you go to Twitter, you'll see there's 5 or 6 or 7 Barnes and Nobles that are really focused on horror, and it's really interesting. So, but that's because those stores can now buy whatever they want. When I was first starting out in the '90s, you had to send you just send a letter to corporate, and basically, and corporate would send you a response, and based on the book and stuff like that. I still have a letter I got from Borders, um, saying they were going to stock my book in their stores. So, who are now gone. So I think that allowed for a lot more horror stuff and diverse genre stuff, specific genre stuff to start popping up in traditional brick and mortar stores.
yeah. What I actually was gonna say though, I'm just because I think you're okay. That's cool to know. What I was actually going to say though was it was interesting to watch because that's when I actually saw some of the more creative horror coming out. Was when this movement to move the horror thing away because they put Stephen King in the main bookshelf, which I think, in all fairness to Stephen King, he probably should be there, to be perfectly honest. But he's not just a horror writer; he writes a little bit of everything at this point in his career.
Yeah,
Um, but it was interesting because there's a guy I can't remember. I think it was Baxter. Um, I was watching what he was doing. It's like that's creative stuff. Like I was watching, like it was interesting that in the quote unquote throes of the removing that shelf, horror writers seem to put out all kinds of more creative stuff right at that moment. It was like, no, we're not going away. We're coming back, and I'm glad to hear it's actually coming back. So cool.
yeah,
Second
yeah,
point, I
yeah.
kind of wanted.
There's a lot of unique, diverse horror being written right now. It's a lot of creative stuff. I mean, yeah, to your point, King. I mean, his last 5 books could be categorized 4 different ways. It's fantasy, or thrillers or whatever. But I guess it's one of
He,
those things where you just have to have a certain base category so people have an idea of what they're getting. But he's
yeah,
grandfathered into that stuff. He can't. There's nothing he can
oh
do about it
no,
now.
I get it. Like, but like he writes so much stuff. Like honestly,
Yeah,
like at this point in his career, classifying him in any one genre makes no sense. He's
yeah,
just so like he's awesome. Like honestly, like the work he's
yeah,
put out there, you cannot help but applaud him because he does a little bit of everything. Now, personally, his novellas I think are his best stuff. That's just my opinion. But anyone any choice, the dude's a great. Technically speaking, he's one of the cleanest I've ever seen. Like just wow, right?
yeah.
So
He's a great writer, and his new book is straight up fantasy. Frankly, it's not even. I don't know if it was his first novel, it would not be
he's done
considered
that
horror. But
before.
yeah, yeah, and
He's done
his
it before. Like
style.
Eyes of the
Eyes of the Dragon. Yeah, yeah, yeah. But his,
Yeah,
his
it's
style has
dragon with
changed.
fantasy.
His style has changed dramatically. Um, if you read his early stuff, I mean, from to where to what he's writing now, he's a much different writing style now than he had when he was writing Pet Cemetery and that kind of stuff. He was much more experimental and his writing was kind of more. I would say a little wilder, a little, like he, a lot of semicolons, a lot of giant parenthetical asides, and he was just, kind of wrote with a more a wild style. And now his writing, I would say from 11/22/63 on, especially, is very clean, very, really sharp, um, and it's more way more straightforward. And I love his, it's very readable, so readable, and so but yeah, but it's interesting how his style has changed over the decades.
Yeah, I'm a big Dark Tower fan of his. Like then that's I think Stephen King before the accident and Stephen King after the accident are very different writers. But not like again, he cares about a lot of the same things. But I think that's where just my opinion, right?
Well, yeah, he's
I
also
could be
getting
wrong.
older. I think he's getting older, and I think as you get older, um, you have interest in different things.
Sure.
Just like bands, evolve. And artists, painters evolve, writers evolve, and I think yeah, the subjects that he wants to tackle now are much different than what he was
Oh, sure.
tackling back then. But I don't think we're going to see another, Pet Cemetery from Stephen King. But that's okay. The stuff he's writing now, like Billy Summers, was one of my favorite novels, the last couple of years, and I don't even think that's I would not classify that as horror in any way. So, yeah,
No,
he's managed to evolve, but still creates amazing content.
oh no. Again, as a writer, you can't nothing but take your hat off to him because that's what he does, right? He's really really good no matter what he writes. Um, for me, that nose was like, well, no, he's technically speaking, he's pretty damn good. It was Duma Key for me. Duma Key was the book where I
Yeah,
read it. It was like, I don't think there's just a mistake in here at all. Like, it was one of the cleanest things I've ever read. It was just like, wow. Like, yeah, my
yeah,
hat's off to him.
very underrated book, Doomickey. One of his
Yeah,
best
yeah,
books.
it's a very fun one and done. It doesn't really hit anything else, but in and of itself, it's really fun. Going to you, and this is kind of why I would do that dovetailed here. It sounds like you did the same thing when you got into literary. Like for you, like I consider like what we do kind of like we're musicians that carve. When I was younger, I did wildly imaginative stuff. Now that I'm older, I still like that stuff, but I want to have good characters in there because if there's no good characters, there's no point in having fun, right? Right now I'm whimsical as hell, and that's just me. And I'm just gonna put random stuff. In one of my novels, I have a zombie mobster. It was fun. Like his dialogue was very dude. But even so, it's the main story. If it's not good, it's not good. It sounds to me like for your horror, like you like classical literature has a tendency to teach you how to tell because it does is a little bit more methodical in some ways. It's almost like a step by step process of like this is how you build, make people care about these characters, right? So when things do happen, like classic literature tends to make you care, build it up. I look at something like Les Miserables, Jean Valjean, right? Something like that, where you just look at that and see how they built him up to be the character he was. So when he's pursued, you feel a lot more sympathy. It's a slower read, but you still get invested. It sounds to me like you hit a point when you know when those things wrap together. It's like I want to give up more. I want to care more about my characters before I put them through all the weird shit I'm going to put them through. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's very accurate. I mean, and that's, something that comes up in reviews a lot with my work is I'm very focused on creating. I spend probably a lot of time setting up a story. I set up the characters. I established kind of the atmosphere, um, and then the horror, the supernatural, scary stuff usually happens kind of, once that's all structured. And it's, you could call it a slow burn, but I also write. I've written lately I've been trying to write. I've been just for fun. I've written more stuff that's more in the pulp vein, just because I really wanted to write some kind of crazy or wild stuff. But yeah, I think people have to have empathy for the characters that you create. Not just because you want to be a good writer or write a good story, but also because you want people to be truly uh, scared, and you want them to be affected by what happens to the characters emotionally. And I think that if they don't connect with the characters, they're not going to be as, they're not going to have the same responses, that they would have if they actually cared about something, about a person, or and so I think for me it's important. I don't know if it's something I ever consciously thought about as much as it's just kind of my natural style.
Yeah,
I think
yeah.
my voice, if you will. Yeah, but especially
Well,
with a novel, you really got to set everything up, but you also don't want to like bore the reader. You want it to stay entertaining, and you want to want them immediately engaged. And there's different ways to do that. There's different tricks that you can do, but yeah, but for the most part, yeah, characters to me are very important. It's actually it's kind of, before I write anything, I kind of have to establish who my characters are. I know a writer who, I do a podcast called The Dark Word where we talk about writing all the time, and one of the writers came on recently, Rachel Harrison, and she said that I it always starts with her character, and she writes everything to date anyway, in first person. And so she's like, once I know the character really well inside and out, then I kind of travel with them through the story, and they is the way they react and the way they see things and stuff like that is my way of like telling the story. So it's a unique way of doing it, and it's somewhat limiting to write in first person, but it's also, it gives a reader a lot more of a lot more broader window into what that person's thinking and feeling, and you can kind of get into it more. And there's something about I think that gets readers more engaged,
well,
easy more
well,
easily.
well. It's also the fact that, okay, especially since most intro characters feel a certain way. Like there's an expectation. Like the Percival formula is still very much a thing. So, and one of the reasons it works is because Percival doesn't know anything. Well, the reader doesn't know anything either. So they have something in common. So when one discovers, the other discovers. So you almost have this ability to grow together. It's why it always works. See Spider-Man. Spider-Man's the ultimate Percival, Skywalker, you name it. Doesn't matter, right? It's everywhere. So when you do the I first person narrative, I think what it is, and I played with it. I played with it. The downside to it is you can't. It's very hard to expand the world beyond the reader's perspective,
Right.
right? Without making the unless you want to make that narrator very unreliable. Because if you do that, that's interesting. You can do some really neat things with that, but at the same time, what you're looking at uh, dealing with is that you, that the reader to feel about them. Same time, do I trust this character? Do I like this character? Do I respect this character? You have to have that really figured out in a first person. Whereas in a third person, you can play with that a lot more because what happens is now the world is bigger than that. So you can introduce elements to the story, right, at any point you like to add a dimension to the story. It's like in fantasy, introduce the epically big bad guy, third person, right? Well, then at some point your characters are going to meet that character. It's like, oh, what's going to happen? And you build to that. It gives you something to build towards, or a device, or an event, or something to that effect, right? Even in a horror novel, like a third person, like say it's a plague novel, right? Right? The idea of an outbreak hitting and killing a town in a distance. How is that going to affect you here? You can create all kinds of things in third person. That first person has a limiting thing. But the thing about first person is, yeah, it's easier to open that connection. Does that make sense what I'm saying there?
Yeah. Yeah, totally. Yeah, it's definitely, like I said, it's limiting, but I think but it's just a different way to tell a story. And I think, I think like getting back to the, idea of like it's what each story needs might not be, is different. And um, one of the things that I think we have to decide before we start a new story is, how am I going to tell this story? What's the most effective way for me to tell this story? Is it to keep it within one person's limited, range of, what they're seeing and hearing and thinking and feeling, or do I want to go more omniscient and kind of introduce like this broader deal of what's going on in the world around them? And it's really just a matter of the story that you're telling and how you want to tell it. I think I wrote the novel that's coming out next summer. I wrote from alternating perspectives. Each chapter is kind of a different uh, character perspective, but only one of the characters is written in first person. The rest are written in third person. And I did that to kind of purposely, because it's exactly to what we're talking about. With this one person, I wanted the reader to be more in tune to what they were thinking and feeling, and their limited knowledge of what was going on around them. Whereas with the other parts of the book, I wanted to be able to expand on what's happening and kind of let the readers know more about what's happening. So, and it worked out, but it's a tricky thing to balance. But yeah, but I think, like I said, ultimately it's got whatever serves the story that you want to tell. That's how you do it. And also, is it past tense? Is it written in present tense? What's the overall tone? Is it light? Is it heavy? Is it comedic? Is your prose going to be dense, or is it going to be, are you skating on thin ice? So all that stuff goes into how you tell a story, and as well as much as and I think it affects the experience of a reader as much as the plot does.
So no, it totally does. So I have a very interesting. So I draw as well. I'm not going to say I'm good at it, but I draw, right? And what I found is when I do different styles of how I'm telling stories, because everything's storytelling to me at the end of the day. I become better with my toolbox of what I do want to talk about, right? That's a big part of it. So my question is, you screen wrote. So screenwriting is a very interesting writing style in the sense that your words have to carry a very particular weight because the words the actors are speaking on top of what you're seeing, that's how you tell the story, right? And that's a really like it gives you a very good ear for dialogue, but it's one of those things where you look at it and go, how much story? What are you telling about the character and how they speak in their cadence? And since you seem to be very much into character and horror, what did screenwriting like? How did screenwriting inform your novel choices?
Yeah, so I wrote. It was interesting because I wrote a lot of fiction and kind of had zero success with it. And then around 2010, I started writing screenplays and had moderate success with it. I wrote a bunch of screenplays for Disney. I wrote a couple for, I wrote a Lifetime movie. And I had other screenplays, that were bought but never made. And so I kind of did that for a while. And then, like I said, around 2015, I went back to kind of focusing more on fiction because I wasn't really enjoying writing screenplays, frankly. Um, and but you definitely learn. I think more than anything, you learn structure. You have to. Screenwriting is very, it's very structured as far as how you tell the story, and there are certain parameters that you have to utilize, and you can play with it. You can bend the rules a little bit here and there, but for the most part, a producer they expect a certain kind of screenplay. They expect the beats to be a certain way. They expect the acts to be a certain structure, a certain way. The character arcs to be a certain way. So I think more than anything, that is the kind of stuff that went into what I'm writing now. More specifically, I think the novels than the short work that I'm doing. But I am definitely a very structured storyteller, and I'm a big outliner. Everything before I write the first paragraph of a novel, I've got an extensive, you know, outline of what happens chapter by chapter, and that may change as the story goes on. I may decide to go a different direction, but at least I know initially um, exactly what I'm going to be writing, exactly what the story is. And that helps me because I don't want to. For me, I don't want to be worried about what's going to happen next while I'm writing. I just want to write. I want to focus on the writing. I want to focus on the prose. I want to focus on the dialogue and all that kind of stuff. I don't want to think about like, oh, well, wait a minute, what's going to happen next? And I think a lot of longer fiction suffers from writers not doing that because they just like, oh, I'm just like an artist and I'm a pantser and I'm just going to like go. And that you can do that, and some people and you can have success with it. But I think it ends up being like you end up running into dead ends. You end up having scenes that you don't need. Um, and not everything is informing the story or moving the story forward. So I think it's to each his own. But for me, screenwriting taught me how to tell a story, and yeah, there's dialogue to a degree, but frankly, dialogue in screenwriting and dialogue in novels are pretty apples and oranges. But yeah, but that's where I would say I took away the most is structure, storytelling structure, and I applied that to at least to my longer work. With my short fiction, to a degree, I don't worry about that sort of stuff. But with my longer work, novellas or novels, I definitely want to have a more traditional structure.
It sounds to me like screenwriting gave you the discipline to write better novels. Is basically what it sounds like. It taught you the discipline and everything. You kind of, I'm not saying you didn't write well before, but I think it changed your whole perspective at least a little bit. And now you got like you have a process that works for you.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I wrote three novels.
Yeah.
You know, before call it the before time. Um, that were definitely written much differently. It was just, oh, I had this idea, and I have the basic idea of the characters, and I have a basic idea of where I want to go with it, and I was just writing, and it was great, and they weren't bad. But I think it's just, but yeah, then after screenwriting, you learn a lot of lessons, and it's a lot of people roll their eyes at this stuff because they feel it's anti art or whatever or anti creativity to have story structure and stuff like that. But the reality is, it allows you more freedom because if the skeleton is in place and the framework is in place for what you're going to do, you can kind of go a bit more wild because you know where you're going, so you can kind of have a lot more flexibility with what you're writing in that moment. And you can always, like I said, you can always change your mind. But and if the story goes a different way, the story goes a different way, and that's happened to me. But I like definitely not having to think about how where is this story going next from a plot perspective. I like to have all that stuff figured out, so have more freedom when I'm actually doing the writing.
It's interesting. Like it's one of those funny things. Like I dabble in different things. And one of the things I do like with let's say comics, I've noticed this when I've worked with other artists is the more structure I tend to have, the better it is for the final product. In most cases, now I'm not quite as dense as you. I do leave room for some scenes here and there, but I always know where I'm going. Always, because if I don't have that, what am I doing? Like I can't
Yeah,
do it. Now some people have that in them. God bless them. Like that's awesome. But I don't have that skill. I need to. But once I have like this idea of okay, I'm going here, then it gives me the freedom to go. I don't have like people expect me to get here like this. What if I did it this way? Right? That's
yeah,
where I think the fun in the structure is you have the ability now going like you know where the end goal is, how you get there, and also I mean it just because you have a structure as you said, I'm sure this has happened to you. Characters will surprise you. It's like oh I wrote this point and
absolutely.
get to this point you're like so this structure doesn't I don't need to go this way. So I like it's going this way. So you tend to listen to your characters when they kind of tell you to go into a different direction. Then
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a very good point. Yeah, I mean, I wrote a story. I have a book that I wrote called "The Blue Butterfly," and it was actually I'd written it first as a screenplay. I sold it as a screenplay, and then it ended up not getting made, and the rights came back to me. So now I was like, well, I'm just going to write this as a novel. And to your point, exactly. I mean, this thing was so because it had been screenplay. I'd already done the outline, extensive character development. I knew exactly what the story was, and so I kind of you still make pretty there's still wholesale changes when you're writing into a novel, but I kind of went back to the drawing board and I kind of relayed out the whole thing from beginning to end. But yeah, I think it was about I don't know, it's right around the halfway through the book. One of the characters did something they were totally not supposed to do, and it threw off the entire book. And I had to completely retool the second half of the book because of what this character did that I was not expect neither I was neither expecting them to do it, nor did I want them to do it because it really screwed me up. Um, but that, yeah, to your point, it happens. You follow your character's lead. There comes to a point where they're the ones who are in the story. You're just kind of the one, retelling what's happening to a reader. So, yeah, it definitely you definitely have those moments where a character does something unexpected, and causes you to make changes for sure.
Well, I think that's actually my favorite part. I love being surprised. I think here's the thing. I think there's I think everybody has a different level. It's fun for you. I mean, it's a job, yes, but it's fun for you, right? So the things I think you have fun with are the things you tend to emphasize a little bit more because obviously you're going to get more work done if it's fun, right? I enjoy the surprise. I do enjoy being surprised a little bit. Now I don't necessarily. Again, I do need a direction. I do need a compass, or I'm just gonna go like no pun intended. What I said earlier, fall down rabbit holes and not quite sure how I'm going to get out of them because that does happen a lot for a lot of people, me included. Um, but when a character kind of just goes up to me, it's like kind of go in this direction. I actually enjoy that. It's like it gives me. I can feel if I'm going to be surprised in this moment. I think a reader will be.
Yeah,
Did you hear
you
me?
froze. Yeah, yeah. No, it's 100% true. And I will also, I will also be, something I do a lot is I will be telling, not so much with novels, but in like novellas or short fiction, I'll be halfway through a story and I kind of have an idea of where I want to go. And there will be a part of me that will kind of put the reader hat on and be like, if you know where this is going to, as a reader, if I know where this is going, then as a writer, I'm like, well, hold on, let's hit the pause button for a minute. Maybe we do something completely different that the reader's not going to expect, and
Yeah.
I'll step away from the story and I'll think about what would I, if I was a reader, what would I think would be cool, or what do I think would be exciting or interesting, because I think where I'm going with this is a little too traditional or a little too expected. So that happens to me all the time, and with novels, see, the problem is there's with novels like there's certain realities. Okay, the first reality is if you are publishing with a traditional publisher, especially a big five publisher, when you turn in an outline to that publisher, that's the story. They're giving you a lot of money to write that story. And if you like go all artistic and decide, or let your characters run wild and decide that you're going to write something different and turn that in, there's a very good chance that that publisher will not pay you for that book. So that's reality. But from an artistic perspective, you still want to be, to your point, yes, you want to be surprised. And the other reality is a novel is going to be 100,000 words, give or take. If you're talking about an outline that has 50 bullet point fragmented sentences that kind of tell you what's happening in each chapter, there's a lot of wiggle room. I mean, you can still be surprised by how things happen, and I tend to find more fun in in the details of a scene than I do in, oh, look, the plot just took a complete left turn, the story now is something totally different. I really like the surprises that come within a scene where I'm like, oh, that's a cool way for them to say that, or oh, this is an interesting way, for this to play out. And that's kind of what I mean by having more flexibility
Yeah.
within the moment, because I kind of know what the overall structure is going to be. I just need to get them there, but how I get them there is up to me, and I can neck change, every time I sit down at the keyboard.
Well, what you're talking about is expectations because every story has a logical end, but the fun part's the journey to get there. Yeah, like that's the whole thing, and what we're dealing with is the details of those expectations are what make great stories.
Mhm.
Period. Right. So, but I am going to ask this. This is a little aside because sometimes this is what again maybe this is more freedom from a indie perspective than a traditional perspective than this particular point. But what if you stumble into something better than what your outline is, and you go to your editors like this is why I think this is better. Right? Have you ever done that?
Uh, Not yet. I did do. I was writing a screenplay. I just finished a screenplay for a feature film that is based on one of my short stories that was purchased by a producer, and there's a director attached. And so I did. So I did. And so what happens in those situations is you have to give them a treatment, which is this is the screenplay I'm going to write, and they have to all sign off on that treatment because they don't want you to write the screenplay unless they've all agreed on what the
Yeah,
story
makes
is going to
sense.
be. So in that, but I did make a change when I was actually writing the screenplay. I decided there was a much better way to do something in the third act than what I had previously envisioned and had been previously approved. And so I just wrote it that way, and I sent it to them saying, "Just so you know, I made a change. I made a change in the third act." Um, so yeah, so I do, that just happened. So yeah, so if I feel like a story is will be better doing it a different way, I'm absolutely going to do it that way. Um, even if it's something that's been pre-approved, it just gets trickier with
Yeah, no,
publishing. Yeah,
because they're expecting a product and you're supposed to deliver it, and that they're right. But
yeah, and
I also
there are horror stories of writers who have turned in
oh,
manuscripts,
absolutely, no,
and the
no.
publisher's like, "Nope, not buying it. Write another one." And I personally know friends who have gone through
Oh
that.
yeah,
So,
no.
so that's why it's not. Look, honestly, it's not the way I prefer to write. I prefer to have a book finished, written the way I wanted to write it. All the surprises I've already played themselves out, and I deliver that book, and hopefully that book sells. This is the first time I've ever had to write a book this way,
Yeah,
because it's the second book of a two-book deal, and the first book was bought. And the second book had not been written yet, so I basically they bought the pitch. I pitched them
yeah, no,
on an
totally.
idea. Yeah, so it's just different. It's just a different way of. To your point, it's it's traditional publishing versus independent publishing. It's how you do different things. But I really love having a big publisher for these books because they're going to get the book out to a lot more people
Yeah.
worldwide than anyone else, than a smaller press could or I could. So for me, it's great. But I don't know I don't know what the future brings. I don't know what's going to happen after
Well,
this. I may
well,
go back to doing more independent stuff. I don't know.
Well, no. I just no. I think this is a fair point and something that should be worth mentioning before we wrap up here is, yeah. I mean, in one sense, the big publisher is your client. They have a certain expectation, and you're just doing your job and delivering it. And it's, I mean, in one sense, it's not yours anymore. They bought it, right? So that, I mean, you have to cater to that, and that's honestly good business, right?
Yeah,
But I know this too. It's one of those situations where it depends on the publisher, depends on their expectations and stuff like that too. But I mean, they're definitely I have in my experiences working in traditional myself, they are open to working with you if they do think better, right? It is one of those things where it's just like, but for everybody, but for every situation, it's case by case.
yeah, it's definitely case by case, and it's not like no. I mean, these guys are the editors and the publishers that you work, their life is
Yeah.
fiction and literature. Like they love storytelling. It's not like they're a guy. I'm not talking to a room full of
No,
old
not even
guys in
close.
suits. So these are people who love the process. And no, 99 times out of 100, they want the writer to be comfortable and to write what they want to write. It just comes down to business,
Yeah.
and I think that you just have to be aware. And it's a little bit different. Like I was in a situation where this is a few years back where my first agent, I'm on my third agent now, my first agent was pitching a novel, and I wanted to, and I said to him, I said, and he's somebody who was interested in buying it. And I said, I don't really want, I said, I want to be able to, I want to be able to flex from the outline that you're shopping. And he kind of teed off on me. He was like, not only can you not flex or fluctuate or vary or change or alter or reimagine anything that you've given me, it has to literally be this book that I'm
Yeah.
selling. Yeah, this is the book. Like, don't change anything, because and that was harsh for me to hear as a new writer, and that made me very uncomfortable. And that was one of the reasons I'm no longer working with that agent. But that's an extreme example. because I think like the situation I'm in now, for example, they've already bought one of my books. They love my writing. They're big fans of my work. So
Yeah.
we're kind of working together on what this next project is. It's not like some draconian thing. It's just a matter of but at the
I,
same time, you want to be careful because you don't want to write a novel which takes an incredibly long time, turn it in, and have them say like, no, this doesn't work for us. That's why it's
no,
important to have the outline be somewhat close to what
oh
you're going to
no,
end up
no.
giving. Yeah,
Like I think the important thing you said there is it's a collaborative process. They
for sure.
understand that somewhere in the process you might change a little bit, and that's fine. But at the same time, they paid for a certain kind of book. They're going to
Right.
expect a certain kind of book, and that's fair,
Yep. Yeah.
right? That's totally fair. And sometimes you compromise. Sometimes you get some things to go your way. Sometimes they get things to go their way. Sometimes you guys come to a wonderful solution in the middle. It's like that works for both of us. Awesome, right?
Yeah.
But that's also, but that too is part of the business and some of the
Yeah.
better
And that
parts of
can
it.
happen even with a book that's already finished. You can
Yeah,
turn in a book that's finished and have the editors come back to you and say, we want to do we want a pretty major rewrite based, and here's our ideas. And you have to do it. And I mean, you can have a conversation about it, but the reality is, to
yeah,
your point, they're the ones who have paid for the book. They're the ones who are putting out the book. They're the ones who need to recoup their advance on the book that they get. So it's more of a business, but ultimately it's a very creative business. It's very collaborative. The guys I'm working with right now in Orbit and Tor Nightfire are really great, and they've been very like open. Like the book I turned in, Boys in the Valley, that's coming out next July. I don't, they're not going to make me change a word.
no,
So it kind of comes down to, if they feel they can make the book better, then they will try to make the book better and work with you on making the book better. And frankly, most of the time, in my experience, when an editor suggests something, they're usually
they're
right.
usually right. They're usually right.
Yeah,
Right, they're
they'll see
usually right.
everything. You're so like, you're so into it, and you've read the same stupid story 400 times or the same book 10 times, you just become numb. I think it's like when you
Yeah,
live in a house for for 50 years, and then somebody comes to visit you and they're like, why is this place so filthy? And you're like, oh, is it? you know um
you get
so
forest
I
in the
think it
trees. You can't see it. You just can't
yeah, so
anymore.
I think it's editors are really good at their jobs, and ultimately everyone just wants to put the best book out there, and I've had nothing but positive experiences so far.
Yeah, no, and honestly, that's the majority of people that are in that, like that do end up going that route. If they get there, it's by and large a positive experience. I mean, there are
Yeah.
horror stories both ways, but that's not what we're here to talk about today, right?
There
So
are, there are horror stories on the indie side. There's horror stories on the big five side. Yeah, you can. Yeah, it's not a look. Yeah, it's not an easy. It's not an
it's
easy
business.
racket.
No, no,
It's a
no,
business.
it's business,
Yeah,
like and to put it like bluntly, like no matter which way you go, there are risks, and
yeah,
sometimes everybody eats a little crow. Just
yeah,
the nature of the beast. It
yeah,
is what it is.
yeah, yeah. And I've had a lot of
So
really bad. I've had a lot of really bad early experiences that have, frankly, helped me a lot. Now with where I am now, you learn from those.
oh,
You learn from
absolutely.
those negative experiences. Yeah,
Well, I mean that's part of the fun of this journey as well. Is the learning process. Well, Mr. Phillip, I've enjoyed this. I still kind of want to apologize you on the air. I screwed up, folks. We should have been a little earlier than what it was. I just want to apologize on the air for that.
no,
But
no
I've enjoyed
worries.
this conversation. How about you?
Yeah, it's been fun. Absolutely, it's always good to talk about writing.
Yeah. So how do we? Okay, you got 3 books coming out. So one's next month, right? So I think probably what we should do to wrap this up, you should plug the current book coming out and how people can find you.
Yeah, so the book coming out, it's coming out October 18th. It's called A Child Alone with Strangers. It's a 600-page crime horror hybrid novel, and it's up for pre-order everywhere. You can pre-order from Amazon, Barnes and Noble, uh, bookshop.org, whatever you use to buy your books. It's up for pre-order now, and then hopefully in a couple of months, Gothic will be up for pre-order. Gothic right now is only up for pre-order through the Cemetery Dance website, but in the next couple months, it'll be wider. But Child of No Strangers is the next one, and you can pre-order that now. You can also pre-order Boys in the Valley anywhere in the world. Uh, in the UK, you can pre-order it from Waterstones or from uh, Amazon.uk or any other UK retailer. In the US, same deal. It's everywhere. So all my stuff you can pretty much order now. And I also will plug this. I also offer most of my books signed editions of my books are available through vjbooks.com, victorjacksonbooks.com. So if you want a signed book, that's a great place to go.
So hold on a second here. So that's the place?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm actually
Sweet.
their featured author of the month for September. So all my books are half off.
So definitely go check this out, ladies and gentlemen. If you want to get an autograph, you want Phillip to deface the book, and you're an honor, you will do it, and it'll be right there.
Yeah.
So, I hope we get a chance to chat again. You're definitely an interesting conversation, and definitely glad that I'm happy for your success, man. Congrats on all your books. So
Thanks.
maybe we're not.
Thank you.
Maybe next year when the boys summer comes out, right? You want to come back and chat again about it?
Yeah, it'd be great. Absolutely. Yeah, I'll be doing a lot of press for that one, so would love to come back and chat. Absolutely.
Yeah, that sounds like fun. I might be at around episode 1000 by that point. So
Nice.
that'll be So, and that will do it for this episode. Just asking for anyone interested, I do advertising services, videos, audios, words, and pictures for projects and your stuff. You can definitely click on the link here below. I want to thank Phillip for his patience and understanding. He's got some great books out there. Definitely should check them out. And that will do it for this episode, Just Joshing. And so, for everybody watching, everybody listening, thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. Stay inspired. Keep shining in the dark. And I'll see you guys next time.